Your blind date didn't show up either? A single mom's soft voice broke the stillness of the upscale restaurant. Tanisha hadn't planned on saying anything. Her fingers traced the rim of her wine glass, eyes drifting toward the empty chair across from her. Minutes stretched into hours. No text, no call, just an abandoned seat. She hadn't expected to speak to anyone tonight. But when the quiet stranger at the next table spoke, her loneliness seemed less isolating. It was a simple question, but it was enough. Your blind date didn't show up either? Michael didn't plan to look up. The condensation on his water glass was more interesting than the dinner he'd been forced into. His friends had set him up again, and as he watched the time slip away, he wondered if he was ever going to be able to live life beyond this shell of success. His blind date hadn't shown. He wasn't surprised, not really. But then there was her, a woman sitting at a table meant for two, her eyes downcast but not desperate. He hadn't seen her there at first, but her voice reached him across the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't confident. It felt like an invitation to acknowledge the shared solitude between them. Her presence was different, honest. Tanisha's gaze met his slowly. Her words weren't dramatic, just raw. The kind of vulnerability that could only exist in a moment like this. And Michael found himself wanting to stay in it. If you've ever found yourself in an unexpected moment of connection, where everything seemed to shift in an instant, you'll want to stay with Tanisha and Michael as their story unfolds. Will they overcome the walls they've built, or will they let fear keep them apart? Don't miss a chapter of this emotional journey. Subscribe now to follow along and see where this connection takes them. Tanisha's gaze lingered on Michael for a second longer than either of them had expected. It wasn't supposed to be a connection, just a fleeting moment between strangers abandoned by their blind dates. But as she met his eyes, she realized that sometimes even the smallest encounters could shift everything. And so, over the course of one simple question, two lives would begin to intersect in ways neither of them had anticipated. The tension between them was palpable, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In the silence that followed, the words they hadn't said seemed to hover between them. Both were strangers, both left waiting, both aware of the quiet ache of unmet expectations. Tanisha shifted slightly in her chair, her wine glass now forgotten on the table. She had almost convinced herself to laugh it off, chalk it up to a failed attempt at putting herself out there again. But Michael's calm presence was different. The usual nerves, the need to impress, all seemed to dissipate in the face of his nonchalant honesty. She had expected to be disappointed by another cold dinner alone. Instead, she found herself intrigued. "What about you?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Why are you here? Were you looking forward to your blind date?" Michael raised an eyebrow as if he hadn't quite expected the question, but it wasn't an uncomfortable pause. He studied her for a beat, the kind of look one gives when considering whether to tell a story that's far more personal than it seems at first glance. His hand wrapped around his glass, and for a moment he seemed to be lost in thought. "I was," he said quietly, his voice revealing more than he had intended. I wasn't exactly excited, but it was something different, you know? He let out a soft laugh, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I didn't expect this, though. My friends set this up. They've been pushing me to get back into dating. Apparently, I need to re-enter the world or whatever." Tanisha nodded, sensing that there was more beneath his words than he was willing to admit. She wasn't surprised to hear him talk about the pressure of expectations. It was something she had heard many times, usually from people who were desperate to look like they had everything figured out. The man sitting across from her didn't seem like one of those people, though. His polished appearance gave him an air of sophistication, but the exhaustion in his eyes told a different story. "I get it," she said, leaning forward slightly. "My friends don't exactly understand what it's like to try to juggle everything. They think I just need to go out more, meet new people, that kind of thing, but it's not that simple, is it?" Michael's eyes softened as he met her gaze. There was something about the way she spoke, so matter-of-fact, that made him feel understood in a way he hadn't realized he needed. He let out a slow breath, as if trying to release a weight he hadn't even noticed he was carrying. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that simple, it's just—" He paused, unsure of how to express the frustration that had been building for years. "I don't know." I spend so much time making things happen, pushing things forward, and in the end, I don't even know what I'm doing it all for. Tanisha didn't say anything at first, letting the words sink in. She had always been able to sense when people were hiding their true emotions. She had spent years reading people in her work as a social worker, listening to their stories, their fears, and their hopes. But there was something different about Michael's vulnerability. It wasn't the kind that sought pity or sympathy. It was simply the truth, laid bare. Sounds exhausting, she said, her voice soft but genuine. It is, Michael replied, giving a small, rueful smile. I guess that's why I'm here. My friends think it'll fix something, but the truth is, I'm not sure what I'm even looking for anymore. Tanisha could relate more than she wanted to admit. Her own life had become an endless loop of responsibilities and expectations, with little time to figure out what she wanted for herself. Between raising her son and managing her demanding job as a social worker, there was little space left for anything else. Even her attempt at a blind date had felt like something she should do, not something she was excited about. It had seemed like a small step toward reconnecting with herself. But now, with her date having failed to show, she was left questioning whether she had the energy to try again. I know what you mean, she said after a moment, her voice steady. I'm a social worker. I spend most of my time taking care of other people's problems. And when I get home, it's just me and my son. Sometimes I feel like I've lost touch with who I am outside of being a mother, you know? Michael nodded, listening intently. His gaze never left her face as she spoke, and there was something about the way she opened up that made him feel less isolated in his own struggles. It was a rare feeling for him, and it made him hesitate for a second. He wasn't used to this kind of raw conversation. He wasn't used to letting someone see the parts of him he usually kept hidden behind polished presentations and carefully curated conversations. What's it like? He asked quietly. Being a single mom, I can't imagine the pressure you must feel. Tanisha looked down at her hands for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The question was gentle, not invasive, and for some reason it didn't make her feel exposed. She appreciated that. She appreciated the way Michael was treating her struggles with respect, not pity. It's hard, she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet exhaustion. You think you can do it all on your own. You have to. But sometimes it feels like you're carrying the weight of the world and no one even knows it. People think I'm fine because I show up. I always show up. But there are days when I wonder if I'm really living or just getting by. Michael's eyes softened. He understood more than he had expected. It was rare for him to let anyone into his emotional space. But there was something about Tanisha's honesty that made it feel safe. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how much he had been hiding from the world and from himself. I can't imagine what it's like to carry that weight every day, he said. But I get what you mean about just getting by. It's like I'm always moving, always striving, but when I stop to think about it, I'm not really sure what any of it means. I don't know what I'm trying to fix or achieve anymore. They both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air between them. Tanisha realized with some surprise that this wasn't uncomfortable. There was no rush to fill the space with small talk or meaningless reassurances. There was simply the understanding that, in this moment, they didn't have to have everything figured out. For the first time that evening, Tanisha felt a rare sense of comfort in someone else's company. It wasn't romantic or dramatic. It was just human connection. I guess we're both a little lost then, she said with a faint smile. Michael smiled back, the corners of his eyes softening. Yeah, I think we are. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, talking about small things like the weather and their favorite foods. But the bond had already been formed. They both knew deep down that something had changed. Something unexpected had happened in the course of their brief exchange. As the night wore on, the conversation slowed and the restaurant's quiet hum settled around them. Tanisha found herself feeling more at ease than she had in a long time. There was no pressure, no expectation, just the simple relief of being seen and heard by someone who understood the weight of the world, even if just for a moment. By the time the waiter came to ask if they wanted dessert, both of them realized that neither was quite ready to leave. but there was no need for words to fill the silence. The understanding between them was enough for now. They didn't know what this connection meant or where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, both of them felt like maybe it was worth exploring. As the evening wound down, Tanisha stood to leave. She felt the familiar pull of responsibility, the weight of her life calling her back. But as she glanced at Michael, still sitting across the table, she couldn't help but wonder what might happen if they chose to take another chance. On each other, on themselves. "Thanks for listening," she said with a smile, the words feeling more genuine than she had expected. Michael stood up as well, his own smile slow but warm. "No problem. I'll think about that coffee offer." Tanisha hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll think about it too." As they parted ways, neither knew exactly what the future held. But for the first time that evening, they felt a quiet sense of possibility, something that had been missing from both their lives for far too long. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft, golden glow across Tanisha's living room. The usual early morning rush was in full swing. She moved quickly through the small but cozy apartment, making breakfast for her son, Devin, while also packing his school bag. Her mind raced ahead, thinking of the dozens of things she needed to do that day, from meetings at work to calls she had to make to ensure the next school event would go smoothly. She was always moving, always juggling. It was the only way to keep her head above water. Devin, still sleepy, padded into the kitchen in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. His smile, sweet and unbothered by the chaos around him, brought a moment of peace to her morning. She greeted him with a kiss on his forehead and handed him a plate of eggs. "Thanks, Mom," he mumbled, sitting at the table and diving into the food with his usual enthusiasm. Tanisha watched him, a small smile tugging at her lips. She lived for these quiet moments. But even as she basked in the simplicity of her son's joy, the weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her. It wasn't just the day-to-day tasks of motherhood that burdened her. It was the unspoken expectation that she always had to be the one who kept everything together. Her ex-husband, Derek, was hardly in the picture. Their separation had been a painful process, one that left her with more emotional scars than she liked to admit. Devin had been just a toddler then, and since then, Tanisha had learned to navigate the world alone, with no one to share the load. For years, she had relied solely on her own strength. There had been no room for self-care or personal time. Everything had been about keeping Devin safe and giving him the stability he needed. She rarely took the time to think about what she needed. She simply couldn't afford to. But sitting across from Michael the other night, Tanisha had caught a glimpse of something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge in a long time. The exhaustion that came with being the strong one. The constant balancing act between her job and her life as a mother, and the quiet loneliness that often accompanied it. She wanted to ignore it, to push it aside and focus on the task at hand. But she couldn't. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from work, reminding her of an urgent meeting in an hour. She glanced at the clock. She didn't have much time to get ready. Devin finished his breakfast, and Tanisha helped him with his coat and bag. "Mom, will you pick me up from school today?" Devin asked, his eyes wide and hopeful. Tanisha hesitated for a moment. She had a long day ahead, and the thought of adding another errand to her already packed schedule made her stomach twist. But the look in Devin's eyes made her heart ache. He needed her, and that was something she couldn't say no to. "Of course, baby," she said, forcing a smile. "I'll pick you up. Don't worry." She kissed his forehead one last time and watched him run out the door to catch the bus. Once he was gone, she took a deep breath and began mentally preparing for the day ahead. She could do this. She had to. The office was bustling when Tanisha arrived, her mind already cluttered with a dozen things to think about. The meeting went as expected, frantic, a blur of conversation about budgets and deadlines. But in the back of her mind, Tanisha couldn't shake the thought of the brief exchange she'd had with Michael the other night. His quiet honesty had stayed with her. It had made her realize something she hadn't fully admitted to herself. She was burning out. She'd always prided herself on being able to handle everything, but the truth was she was stretched too thin. She had been for years. When the meeting finally ended, Tanisha made her way to her desk and pulled up the notes for the upcoming school event she had to organize. As she sifted through the piles of paperwork, she found herself thinking about Michael again. The way he had opened up about his own struggles, how he had shared the weight of his own detachment from the world. She hadn't expected to feel such a connection so quickly, but she did. There was something about him that made her feel less alone, even if just for a brief moment. Maybe it was because they both knew what it was like to be responsible for everything and everyone. They understood each other in ways that were hard to put into words. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. This time it was from Devon's school. The message made her stomach twist. Devon had been sick yesterday, and his teacher was reporting that he hadn't been feeling well again today. Tanisha quickly texted back asking if he was okay, but she knew it wasn't something that could be fixed with a quick message. She needed to go to him. Tanisha sat in her car outside of the school, waiting for the bell to ring. She had got Devon's message earlier that day, letting her know that he was fine and had finished his homework. The relief she felt was fleeting, another task checked off, but the weight of everything else still loomed large. The familiar routine of picking Devon up felt comforting, but it also reminded her of how little time she had for herself. She was always busy. There was no time to sit and reflect, to even acknowledge what she was going through emotionally. Tanisha often told herself that she didn't have the luxury of self-pity. She was the strong one. Her son needed her to be. As Devon climbed into the car, she put on a smile, asking how his day had been. He launched into a story about his math test, his eyes lighting up with excitement, and for a moment, Tanisha forgot everything else. Her son's laughter was a balm for her weary soul, and she tried not to think about the gnawing exhaustion in her chest. But then her phone buzzed again, and she knew she couldn't avoid the world for long. Later that evening, after dinner and Devon's bedtime, Tanisha found herself staring at her phone. She hadn't realized she was holding it until the screen lit up in her hand. Her mind wandered back to Michael, his face, the way he had shared so much with her in that short time. She hadn't thought about dating in years. And yet, after that brief conversation with him, she found herself wondering if there was more to life than just surviving. Tanisha had been living her life in a constant state of motion, moving from one responsibility to the next, but now she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to stop, to take a step back and to finally be seen for who she was, not just as a mother, a worker, or a caretaker, but as a person deserving of care and connection. But how? How could she allow herself that? Nickel, too, had his own set of burdens, though they were different. He sat in his penthouse apartment that evening, staring out the window at the city below. The lights were beautiful, but they felt distant, cold, like everything else in his life. His world revolved around deadlines, board meetings, and high-stakes decisions, but every once in a while, when the noise of his life quieted, he felt an ache that he couldn't ignore. Despite the wealth, despite the accolades, Michael knew that something was missing. He had become a master of business, but not of relationships. He was always playing the part of the CEO, confident, assertive, in control, but in truth, he hadn't felt truly connected to anyone in years. His friends set him up on the blind date, trying to nudge him back into the dating world, but Michael knew it wasn't just dating he needed. It was a connection, a real one that didn't revolve around performance or appearances. And Tanisha had given him that. For the first time in a long while, he felt like someone saw him, truly saw him, and that scared him more than he was willing to admit. As he sat there alone in his apartment, he reflected on his own detachment from life. The wealth, the success, it had all come at the cost of the things that really mattered. Connection, intimacy, vulnerability. He had spent years avoiding these things, bearing his emotions under the weight of his work. But now, after meeting Tanisha, he realized how much he had been hiding from. Maybe it was time to start letting those walls come down. As the days bumped, Tanisha and Michael continued their lives, each grappling with the weight of their responsibilities. But in the back of their minds, the connection they had briefly shared lingered. Neither was ready to call it a turning point yet, but both knew that their paths had crossed for a reason. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something neither of them could yet fully understand. The quiet hum of the restaurant wrapped around Tanisha like a soft cocoon. The conversation with Michael, which had started off as a tentative exchange of pleasantries and observations, had slowly evolved into something more comfortable, more real. They had shared their frustrations, their loneliness, and for a brief shining moment, it felt like there was no rush, no expectation, just two people connecting without needing to explain everything. She found herself leaning in a little closer with each word he spoke, her laughter more genuine than it had been in weeks. The empty chair across from her no longer felt like a symbol of rejection, but a reminder of the unexpected, strange comfort of this new connection. Michael's voice softened as he told her about the challenges of leading a company, the weight of responsibilities that often felt more like burdens than privileges. You'd think being at the top would feel different, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he reflected. But sometimes it just feels like I'm running a race with no finish line in sight. Tanisha nodded, understanding more than he could have imagined. I know that feeling. I have so many people depending on me, whether it's my son, my clients, or the people I work with. It's easy to lose yourself in it all. She paused, eyes flicking to the empty wine glass on the table, and then to Michael, who was looking at her intently. For a moment, she forgot about everything else, the worry about her son, the endless weight of her responsibilities. She could feel the rare ease of sharing this moment with someone who wasn't expecting her to be perfect, someone who wasn't trying to fix her. He was just there, offering a space to be herself, something she hadn't realized she needed so badly. The words that followed slipped out almost without thinking. You know, I thought this blind date would be just another waste of time, but I'm glad it wasn't. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Michael's eyes softened and his lips quirked up into the faintest smile. Me too, he said quietly. I wasn't expecting to actually talk like this. They both fell into a silence then, a comfortable one where neither felt the need to fill the space. Michael took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he sat back in his chair. Tanisha mirrored his movement, her mind still swirling with the unexpected shift in the night. She had come into this evening anticipating nothing more than a brief, awkward dinner. Yet somehow it had turned into something deeper. But just as she began to think that maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself to enjoy this moment, the buzz of her phone jolted her back to reality. Her hand instinctively reached for her purse, and her stomach tightened when she saw the name on the screen. Her babysitter, Rachel. She'd been waiting for the usual text updates, but this message felt different. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she swiped it open. Hi, Tanisha. I just wanted to let you know that Devin isn't feeling well. He's running a fever. I gave him some medicine, but I think you should come home as soon as you can. Tanisha's heart dropped. The sudden weight of responsibility hit her like a wave. The night, the connection, the shared moment with Michael. It all felt like a distant memory now. The small flicker of hope she'd allowed herself to feel vanished, replaced by the familiar, cold anxiety that settled in her chest whenever something went wrong with Devin. I, I'm sorry, she muttered, barely able to meet Michael's gaze as she stared at the screen. Her thoughts were already rushing ahead, calculating how much time she had before she needed to leave, mentally preparing for the worries she knew would be waiting for her when she got home. Michael watched her closely, sensing the shift in her mood. His hand rested on the table, still impatient, as if he understood exactly what had just happened, even though he hadn't seen the message. Is everything okay? He asked, his voice steady but concerned. Tanisha hesitated, taking a deep breath. Her mind was already filled with thoughts of her son, but she knew she had to answer. My son Devin, he's sick. He has a fever. I need to go. I'm really sorry. She felt the weight of her words hang in the air between them, the apology already forming on her lips before she even finished speaking. The guilt hit her immediately. It wasn't that she didn't care about Michael or the moment they had shared. It was just that, as always, her responsibilities as a mother took precedence. Michael's expression shifted, his concern clear, but there was no judgment in his gaze. He didn't look disappointed, just understanding. There was a part of him that had hoped to continue the evening with her, but he knew in the silence that had settled between them that there was nothing more important than her son. You should go, he said softly, offering her a small, reassuring smile. You don't need to apologize. Tanisha's chest tightened, but she managed a grateful smile. Thank you. I'll think about your coffee offer, she added, though the words felt hollow as they left her mouth. Michael nodded, his eyes flicking to her phone and then back to her face. Take care of him. I hope he feels better soon. The words, simple as they were, felt like a lifeline in the moment. It wasn't just a polite farewell. It was the kind of care and understanding she had rarely experienced. She wasn't just being dismissed or sent on her way. Michael genuinely cared about her situation, and that realization made her feel even worse about leaving. She stood, grabbing her purse with a slightly trembling hand, then straightened herself, trying to maintain her composure. I really did enjoy this, she said, her voice slightly strained but sincere. Thank you for being, well, you. I appreciate this more than you know. Michael stood as well, meeting her gaze. There was no need to say more. Their moment of connection had been brief, but it had been real. And though they both knew it was ending too soon, neither of them would forget it. I'll look forward to that coffee, Michael said, his voice steady. Tanisha nodded, her heart aching with the sudden distance she felt between them. I'll be in touch. As she turned to leave, Michael stood watching her, a quiet sadness settling in his chest. He hadn't expected the evening to take this turn. He hadn't expected to feel so connected, but now, as he watched her walk away, he realized that this brief encounter had meant more to him than he had anticipated. He wasn't just feeling the loss of a missed date, he was feeling the loss of something deeper, something he wasn't ready to confront yet. Tanisha stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights casting a dim glow around her. She wrapped her coat tightly around herself, trying to ward off the chill that wasn't just from the weather. Her mind raced as she made her way to her car. Devin, her son, needed her. There was no time to think about the strange connection she had just made. There was no room for anything other than the familiar worry she had learned to live with for so long. But as she drove home, her thoughts flickered back to Michael. The way he had listened, the way he had shared his own frustrations, the ease with which they had talked. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder what it would be like to stop running from those moments of connection, to give herself the permission to hope. But for now, all she could think about was getting home to her son. Everything else would have to wait. As Michael sat back down at the table, his eyes remained fixed on the now empty chair across from him. The connection they had shared felt like a spark, brief, intense, and then gone. He wasn't sure what he had expected from the evening, but it had certainly been more than he thought. There was something about Tanisha, something about the way she opened up, even for a moment, that had touched him more deeply than he cared to admit. The restaurant buzzed around him, the usual hum of voices and clinking glasses, but all of it felt distant now. He didn't know when it had happened, but something inside him had shifted. He stood and paid the bill, but as he walked out into the night, he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he could allow himself to open up a little more, to let someone in, even if just a little. As he stepped into the cool night air, the city lights blurred in front of him, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt a strange ache in his chest. Not from loneliness, but from something deeper, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face yet. The days that followed the dinner felt surreal for Tanisha. She couldn't quite shake the memory of Michael sitting across from her, his quiet intensity somehow comforting. She found herself replaying the conversation over and over in her head, each word, each look they shared growing more significant as time passed. It wasn't the connection she had anticipated, certainly not from a blind date. And yet, despite the casualness of their exchange, something had shifted in her. Tanisha had spent the past few years building emotional walls, each one stronger than the last. Walls that were fortified by the demands of her life. As a single mother, she didn't have the luxury of vulnerability. There was no time for indulgent emotional detours. Her son, Devin, needed her. Her work as a social worker needed her. She had taught herself to be strong, to be unshakable, to never let anyone see the cracks in her armor. But that night with Michael, those cracks had started to show. She hadn't expected the conversation to go as deep as it did. She hadn't expected to feel that spark of something more than just shared frustration. Something quieter, more tender, but equally powerful. There was an undeniable pull between them, a connection that neither had planned for or even fully understood. As she sat at her kitchen table the next morning, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, Tanisha found herself staring out the window at the gray skyline. The world outside felt distant, muffled, as though she were seeing it through a fog. She had spent her life pushing forward, meeting each challenge head-on without looking back. She didn't have time to linger on what could be. But the question lingered, could she open herself up to something more? Something beyond her routine? Could she risk the vulnerability of letting someone else in? The thought of Michael entering her life, even in the smallest way, both excited and terrified here. It wasn't just the idea of dating or even romance. It was the idea of allowing someone into the carefully structured world she had built. Michael wasn't like the other men she had dated in the past. He wasn't looking for a quick fix or a simple distraction. He was different, gentler in his own way, but still distant in his own right. He had his own walls, his own scars, and yet she couldn't ignore how easy it had been to talk to him, how natural it felt to open up in a way she hadn't done with anyone in years. She had shared things with him she had never shared with anyone else. Her frustrations, her doubts, her fears, and he had listened, truly listened, without judgment. There had been no rush to fix her, no pressure to be anything but herself. She wasn't sure if she was ready to allow that again, to open herself up to someone else. But then again, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was time. Time to stop surviving and start living again. Tanisha sat back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. Her thoughts were racing now, tangled in uncertainty. She felt torn between the life she had created, a life built on stability and protection, and the life she had never allowed herself to explore. The one where she could be vulnerable, where she could let someone else in. The phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her best friend, Sherry. "How'd your date go? Did you have fun?" Tanisha sighed, her finger hovering over the screen. She wanted to tell Sherry everything, to admit that the date wasn't what she had expected. But the truth was, it wasn't just a date. It was something more. She wasn't sure how to explain it to Sherry without sounding like she was overanalyzing. "It was fine, nothing special." She hit send quickly, as if the words themselves might dull the feeling she was still grappling with. She didn't want to go into it. She wasn't ready to talk about it yet. She glanced back out the window, the gray skies mirroring her inner turmoil. It wasn't just the conversation with Michael that was weighing on her. It was everything, the choices she had made in her life, the walls she had built, the decision to close herself off from the possibility of more. It was exhausting living this way, always guarding herself, always afraid of what would happen if she let someone else close. What if they left? What if they disappointed her, like so many before? The fear of rejection, of being abandoned again, had held her back for so long. But as much as she tried to convince herself to stay the course, something about Michael's calm presence, his willingness to just be there, refused to be ignored. She could still hear his voice in her head, the quiet way he had opened up about his own struggles. She wasn't the only one with walls. For a fleeting moment, and she wondered what it would be like to tear those walls down, to let someone in without expecting the worst. Was she brave enough to try? Across the city, Michael sat in his penthouse, staring at his phone as the early morning light filtered through the windows. He hadn't realized how much he had been thinking about Tanisha until the thought of her popped into his mind again. It wasn't like him to get caught up in these kinds of feelings. He had spent so many years focusing on work, on building his company, on creating the perfect image of success. His friends, his colleagues, they all expected him to be this confident, emotionally detached figure, the man who always had a plan, who always knew what to do next. But Tanisha had made him question all of that. The conversation they'd had at dinner had lingered in his mind far longer than he expected. The raw honesty, the vulnerability she'd shared with him, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He wasn't used to people talking to him like that, without any pretense, without trying to impress. Her words had struck a chord deep inside him. He was used to being in control, to managing every part of his life with precision. But here he was, thinking about a woman he barely knew, wondering why her honesty had such an effect on him. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. Why was he even thinking about this? He had everything he could want: success, money, a career that anyone would envy. And yet something about Tanisha's grounded, no-nonsense approach to life made him feel unsettled. Maybe that's what he needed, though. Maybe he had spent so many years building walls around himself that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly connect with someone. He had been so focused on external success that he had neglected the deeper, more meaningful connections that life had to offer. Michael stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. It felt like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't see yet, but he could feel it. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew that staying emotionally distant, staying in his comfort zone, wasn't going to get him there. His mind kept returning to Tanisha. Her vulnerability had shaken him, made him realize how much he had missed by staying emotionally closed off. He wasn't sure where this connection between them would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the pull of something real. It wasn't just about wanting to spend time with her. It was about needing her, to understand what made her so strong, so resilient, and perhaps to finally face the parts of himself he had been avoiding for so long. The next few days passed in a blur, and the more Michael thought about Tanisha, the more he found himself questioning the life he had built. Could he let go of the emotional distance that had kept him safe for so long? Could he allow himself to be vulnerable again? The answers weren't clear, but the desire to find out more about her, to explore this connection, was growing stronger every day. For both Tanisha and Michael, the quiet moments after their conversation were the beginning of something unexpected. Neither of them knew it yet, but the journey they were about to embark on would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, vulnerability, and what it meant to truly connect. And as the days went on, they each found themselves quietly wondering what would happen if they took the next step, if they chose to take a chance on the connection that had already begun to bloom. Fate, it seemed, had a way of weaving people back together, even when they least expected it. Michael hadn't planned on attending the charity event at the local school that morning. He had always preferred to stay behind the scenes, writing checks, making connections, staying busy. But for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he had agreed to join this particular event. The school had reached out to his company with a new initiative for underprivileged children, and for once, Michael wanted to be involved on a personal level. He couldn't keep hiding behind his title or his bank account. As Michael walked into the school's main hall, he could feel the unfamiliar buzz of energy in the air. It wasn't the sterile, polished environment of a boardroom, but a lively, chaotic space filled with children's laughter, the hum of excited voices, and the unmistakable scent of old wood and chalk. The walls were decorated with colorful posters and student artwork, and the sound of shuffling feet echoed down the hallway. It was a stark contrast to the cold, distant atmosphere of his office, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a shift inside him. The event was meant to showcase the school's latest community outreach program, providing resources to families in need. As Michael stood in the crowded room, his eyes scanning the sea of volunteers and parents, he couldn't help but feel the stark divide between the people here, doing work that had real impact, and his own world, where the numbers on spreadsheets determined success. He was just about to make his way toward the stage when a voice stopped him. "Mr. Harrow?" He turned, startled by the familiarity of the voice, yet unsure of who it belonged to. Standing before him, her expression a mixture of surprise and recognition, was Tanisha. Tanisha Bennett. Michael's heart skipped, but he quickly masked the reaction with a smile. "Tanisha," he said, his voice steady, "I didn't expect to see you here." Her eyes flickered for a moment, catching his, and then quickly shifting to a more neutral expression. "It's a small world, I guess," she said with a light chuckle, though there was something more behind her words. "I'm here for the event. I work with the community outreach program." "You?" Michael hesitated before answering. "I'm here to see the program in action. My company's been involved in funding some of the new resources for the school." He wasn't sure why, but her presence in this setting felt different. There was no awkwardness from the night before. They hadn't yet addressed their unexpected connection, but there was an undeniable sense that something had shifted between them. "That's great," Tanisha said, her voice warmer now. I'm sure the kids will appreciate the support. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something or someone before returning to Michael. I didn't expect you to be involved in something like this, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Michael raised an eyebrow. You didn't think I'd care about kids? He chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. I know it's not exactly the kind of event I usually attend, but I wanted to try something different. Tanisha studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. It's good that you're here, she said, her voice softer now. Not a lot of people with your resources take the time to get involved. Michael felt a pang of discomfort at her words, though he wasn't sure why. It wasn't like he had done anything extraordinary. He was here because it had been expected of him. He'd made the donation, signed the checks, and thought that would be enough. But now, in Tanisha's presence, he couldn't help but feel like there was more he could be doing. Before he could respond, a young girl ran past them, giggling as she chased a group of her friends. Tanisha smiled at the sight, and Michael watched her closely, noticing the way she softened around the children. It wasn't something he'd seen before. He had always known her as a strong, no-nonsense woman, the kind of person who didn't give much away. But here, in this environment, she seemed different, more human, for lack of a better word. Tanisha turned back to him, her smile still lingering. You should come meet some of the students, she suggested. They'd love to know more about the program. If you want, I can introduce you to some of the teachers too. Michael nodded, though he wasn't sure what he expected from the interaction. I'd like that. As they walked together through the school hallways, the hum of voices and laughter filling the air, Tanisha began to talk about the school's initiatives, how they were working to provide after-school programs, tutoring, and additional resources to families in need. Michael listened intently, but his mind was preoccupied with something else. The way Tanisha seemed so at ease here, so connected to the people around her. It was a side of her he hadn't seen before, and it made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about her. They stopped at a table where a group of teachers were gathered, and Tanisha introduced Michael. The teachers, all clearly engaged with the work they were doing, greeted him warmly, though it was clear they didn't know exactly how to address someone like him. As Michael shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, Tanisha lingered nearby, watching him. You're different in this setting, she remarked quietly, once they were a bit further away. You seem more engaged. Michael paused, his gaze drifting over the children as they laughed and played in the background. He hadn't thought about it before, but Tanisha's observation felt true. There was something about this environment that made him feel more present, more aware of the people around him, not as numbers or faceless employees, but as real people, with needs and desires and lives beyond his own. I don't know, Shana, he replied slowly. I guess I never really thought about what it means to be present before. He glanced at Tanisha, meeting her gaze. Maybe that's something I've been missing. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. I think we all have moments when we realize we're not living the way we want to. It's easy to get caught up in what we think we need to do instead of what we actually want to do. For a moment, there was silence between them as they both took in the weight of the conversation. Neither of them was pretending to have all the answers, but there was a quiet understanding that had grown between them, a mutual recognition of the pressures and frustrations they both carried. As the event continued, Michael found himself watching Tanisha more than he intended. She moved through the crowd with ease, speaking to students and parents, offering support and guidance without hesitation. She was everything he wasn't: selfless, present, focused on others. It was a stark contrast to his own life, where every action had a strategic purpose and every moment was calculated. And yet, as he watched her interact with the community, he felt a pull. There was something magnetic about her, something real and raw that made him question the life he had built. Tanisha, for her part, wasn't oblivious to the change she saw in Michael. As he engaged with the teachers and students, she could see a shift in him. He wasn't the polished CEO she had met the other night, the man who seemed so distant and detached. He was more. There was something different in his eyes now. Maybe it was the way he listened, really listened when people spoke. Or maybe it was the way he started to see the value in moments like this, when people came together to build something that mattered. They hadn't talked about the night they met, and maybe they never would, but something unspoken had passed between them. And here, in the midst of the school's chaos, it felt like that connection had only deepened. As the evening came to a close, Tanisha found herself standing next to Michael once again, this time outside the building as the last of the volunteers and parents trickled out. She could feel the subtle shift in the air, the weight of the unspoken bond between them. "I didn't expect this to be so impactful," Michael said, his voice thoughtful as he turned to face her. Tanisha smiled. "Sometimes the things we don't expect are the ones that end up changing us." For a moment, they stood in the quiet, the city lights flickering in the distance. Neither of them spoke, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was shared understanding, the kind that didn't need to be explained. Michael glanced at Tanisha, his expression softer than it had been the night they met. "Thanks for showing me this," he said quietly. "I needed it more than I realized." Tanisha nodded. "I'm glad you came." As they said their goodbyes and parted ways, both of them knew that something had changed. They weren't the same people they had been just hours before, and though neither of them could predict where this would lead, they both felt deep down that something important was beginning to take shape between them. Michael couldn't stop thinking about her. It had been a few days since the charity event, and though the noise of his busy life had returned, Tanisha lingered in his thoughts. Her words, her laugh, the quiet way she carried herself, everything about her seemed to pull at something inside him, something he hadn't realized had been buried for years. But just as quickly as that pull had surfaced, a wave of doubt crashed over him. He had spent so many years in control, in charge of every aspect of his life. And here he was, unsure of how to approach something as simple as a connection with another person. It wasn't that he wasn't interested, he was deeply so, but there was something about letting his guard down that terrified him. "I'm not ready for this," he told himself as he sat at his desk, trying to focus on the numbers in front of him. He stared at the same spreadsheet for what felt like hours, but his mind kept drifting back to Tanisha. He'd never felt this torn before. Usually he could compartmentalize his emotions, keep them in neat boxes that didn't interfere with his work. But with her, it was different. He found himself thinking about her even when he didn't want to. The problem wasn't just about her, though. It was about him. Michael had spent so much of his life building walls around his emotions, using work and success as a shield to protect himself from the vulnerability he so desperately feared. "If I let myself feel too much, I'll lose control." That had been his mantra for years, but now, standing in the quiet of his apartment after another long day, he couldn't ignore the growing ache in his chest. He hadn't let himself get close to anyone in so long, not like this, not with someone who seemed to see right through the carefully constructed walls he had put up, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. Across town, Tanisha sat in her small but cozy apartment, scrolling through her phone with no real destination in mind. Her son, Devin, was asleep in his room, the soft hum of the night wrapping around her as she tried to wind down from her hectic day, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about Michael, the way he'd looked at her at the charity event, the way he had listened without judgment. She hadn't expected to feel this way. After all, she had learned long ago to keep her heart protected. Raising a child on her own was difficult enough without adding the weight of romantic expectations. And yet, after her brief encounters with Michael, she found herself wondering if maybe it was time to open up again. Maybe she had closed herself off for too long. Maybe she had been afraid of something that was worth taking a chance on. But then, just as quickly as those thoughts had come, doubt crept in. She had been burned before, and she wasn't ready to repeat that mistake. She wasn't sure she could bear the weight of another failed relationship. It was easier to keep things at arm's length, to stay focused on what mattered. Devin, her job, the responsibilities that always seemed to come first. "But that's not all I am," she thought, her finger hovering over the phone screen. "I deserve more than just surviving." She wanted to reach out to Michael, to tell him how much his presence had meant to her, but there was a part of her that recoiled at the idea. What if he's not really interested? The thought of putting herself out there again, only to be let down, made her stomach tighten. She had always been the one who held everything together, the one who didn't rely on anyone else for support. And the idea of letting someone in, someone like Michael, with all his complexity and emotional walls, was both alluring and terrifying. Days passed and their connection grew, but neither of them acknowledged it directly. It was a strange, quiet tension that settled between them, a knowing that neither was ready to confront. They ran into each other a few times at work-related events, shared brief, polite conversations, but the air between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Michael noticed it too. He'd catch himself staring at Tanisha when she wasn't looking, admiring the way she moved through the room, always so composed, so strong. He wanted to say something, wanted to reach out, but his fear of vulnerability held him back. Every time he thought about calling her, his mind would race with excuses. What if she doesn't feel the same way? What if I'm just another distraction for her? He had never been good at this, the simple act of letting someone in. For all his professional success, Michael had never been able to break free of the emotional barriers he had built. The thought of exposing himself to another person, especially someone like Tanisha, made his stomach churn with anxiety. He wanted to connect with her, to be there for her, but he didn't know how to do that without feeling like he was losing control. Tanisha, on the other hand, was caught in a similar bind. She would think about Michael during the quiet moments of her day, the way he had looked at her with that quiet, understanding gaze, the way he had listened to her without interrupting. There was a kindness in him that she hadn't expected, something that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. But then the doubts would surface. What if he's only interested because I'm someone he can fix? She didn't want to be another project for someone. She had spent her entire life doing the work of supporting others, and she wasn't sure she was ready to let someone take that role in her life. There was a part of her, though, that wanted to let him in. She had spent so long keeping her emotions locked away, afraid of what might happen if she let herself feel too much. And Michael, he had a way of making her feel like maybe, just maybe, it was worth taking a chance. But the fear always lingered, fear that if she let him in, he would see the cracks in her armor, the places where she wasn't as strong as she appeared. She had built her life around being independent, and the thought of relying on someone else, of being vulnerable, scared her more than she wanted to admit. One evening, they found themselves at a work event once again. The room was crowded with people, some talking in groups, others mingling by the bar. Tanisha had just finished a conversation with a colleague when she felt Michael's presence behind her. She turned to find him standing there, his usual composed demeanor softened by something else, something she couldn't quite place. "Hey," he said, his voice low and warm, though tinged with uncertainty. "I've been meaning to ask, how are you doing? I mean, with everything, your work, your son." Tanisha's heart skipped at the question. She hadn't expected him to ask, hadn't expected him to care. She looked into his eyes, seeing the same hesitation in him that she felt in herself. "I'm managing," she said, offering a small smile. "Life's never really quiet, but you make do." Michael nodded, his gaze not leaving hers. "I get that. It's like, the more you have to do, the harder it gets to remember what you really want, you know?" Tanisha's breath caught slightly. For a moment, it was like the rest of the world faded away, and all she could hear was his voice. It wasn't just polite small talk. It was something deeper, something raw. "I know exactly what you mean," she said, her voice quieter now. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just going through the motions. I have to keep going, keep doing, but I don't know, it's hard to remember who I am outside of all of that." Michael's expression softened, and for the first time he felt that familiar wall begin to crack. He wasn't sure what it was about Tanisha. Maybe it was the way she spoke so honestly, the way she let him see the real her, but he couldn't ignore the pull. And she wasn't just another woman. She was someone who understood the weight of responsibility, who had lived through the same pressures that haunted him every day. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken understanding between them, something they had both been hesitant to acknowledge. But in that silence, something shifted. Tanisha broke it first. "I think we both have a lot to figure out," she said, her tone softer now. "But I'm glad we can talk, even if it's just for a minute." Michael nodded, the tension between them palpable but not uncomfortable. "Me too," he said quietly. Me too. And in that brief exchange, they both understood that while they weren't ready to make any grand gestures, they were ready to be honest with each other in a way they hadn't been before. But the question remained, could they overcome their fear of vulnerability, or would they continue to retreat into the safety of their walls? Only time would tell. The day started like any other for Tanisha, filled with the hum of routine, packing lunches, juggling phone calls, and making sure Devin, her 10-year-old son, was ready for school. As always, she balanced the weight of responsibilities like an expert acrobat, knowing that every moment mattered. Every decision was one step closer to holding it all together. But life, as it often does, had a way of changing the course of things with a single phone call. She had just returned home from a meeting with a new case when the phone buzzed in her bag. Her heart sank when she saw the name flashing on the screen. The school nurse. Tanisha's stomach tightened, a familiar knot of anxiety creeping into her chest. "Ms. Bennett," the nurse's voice crackled through the line. "It's about Devin. He's running a fever and not feeling well. I think it's best if you pick him up." Tanisha's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a fever. It was the reminder of the unpredictability that came with being a single mother. No matter how well she planned, something always managed to disrupt the delicate balance she worked so hard to maintain. "Thank you. I'll be there as soon as I can," she replied, already moving toward the door, her mind racing. As she drove toward the school, Tanisha couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. Devin wasn't a child who got sick often, and whenever he did, it always seemed to be more than just a cold. She'd been through these moments before, racing to the school in a panic, feeling like she was always on the edge of something breaking, always playing catch-up. Her thoughts spiraled until she reached the school. Her heart pounded as she rushed inside to find Devin sitting on the nurse's office cot, looking pale but trying to put on a brave face. The worry in his eyes only deepened the concern in her chest. "Hey, buddy," Tanisha said softly, brushing the hair from his forehead. "How are you feeling?" "I'm okay, Mom," he whispered, his voice weak. "Just tired." She kissed his forehead, her hands trembling slightly. As she helped him stand, her mind raced through the endless responsibilities of the day. She needed to call her supervisor, reschedule some appointments, and figure out how to get Devin home and into bed while keeping everything else moving. But then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Michael. "Is everything okay? I've been thinking about you and Devin." The unexpected message caught her off guard. She hadn't heard from him since their brief but meaningful conversation at the school event, but there was something about his words now that made her heart beat a little faster. She quickly typed back, letting him know what had happened. "Devin's not feeling well. I'm picking him up now." She paused before hitting send, then added, "Thanks for checking in. It means a lot." Before she could overthink it, she pressed send. Michael's response came quickly. "I'm here if you need anything. Don't hesitate to ask." She stared at the message for a long time, feeling a strange warmth in her chest. She didn't know what to make of the connection she and Michael had, but something about his offer of support felt different from the others in her life. "Mom, can we go home?" Devin asked, his voice small. Tanisha took a deep breath, pushed aside the nagging feelings of guilt, and smiled. "Let's get you home, baby." By the time that Tanisha got Devin settled on the couch with a blanket, she was exhausted. She had done everything, called the doctor, checked in with her clients, and made sure Devin was comfortable. But the weight of the day, coupled with the anxiety of not being able to do it all, had drained her. Just as she was about to sit down to rest for a moment, her phone buzzed again. Michael. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon after their exchange. "I know you're probably tired, but if you need anything, anything at all, please let me know. You don't have to do this alone." Her chest tightened. There was no way she could ask him to help. She didn't even know what she needed, except for some peace, some reprieve from the constant pressure. But his words hit her differently this time, reminding her that she didn't have to do everything on her own. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she debated whether to respond. The last thing she wanted was to burden Michael, someone she barely knew, with her problems. But at that moment, his offer of support felt like a lifeline, a thread that might help her keep from unraveling. Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. She wasn't ready to tell him everything, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to admit that she needed help, even if that help came from someone she hadn't fully allowed herself to trust yet. Diane. It wasn't long before Michael called. Tanisha glanced at the phone and hesitated, but then, with a quiet sigh, she answered. Hey. Michael's voice was warm, steady, and surprisingly calm. How's Devin doing? Tanisha smiled faintly, grateful for his concern. He's resting. The fever's a bit high, but hopefully it'll pass soon. There was a pause on the other end of the line. She could almost hear Michael thinking, weighing his next words. You're doing an amazing job. You know that, right? Tanisha felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say that. It wasn't something she heard often, especially not from people who didn't understand the weight of her daily responsibilities. Thanks, she whispered, feeling vulnerable but not ashamed. It's hard sometimes. Harder than I ever let on. Michael's voice softened. You don't have to pretend, Tanisha. I know what it's like, trying to keep it all together while feeling like everything could fall apart at any second. But you're doing it. You're here, and that means something. She swallowed, feeling a rush of emotion that she hadn't expected. She didn't know if it was the stress of the day or the realization that someone truly understood her struggles. But the tears came before she could stop them. I feel like I'm always holding my breath, she confessed, her voice cracking slightly. Like one wrong move, and everything I've built could fall apart. It's exhausting. I don't know how to do this anymore. Michael was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke, his voice firm and reassuring. You're not alone, Tanisha. Not anymore. It wasn't a grand gesture. There were no sweeping promises, but it was enough. Enough to make her realize that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to keep carrying everything on her shoulders by herself. Later that night, after Devin had fallen asleep on the couch and Tanisha was finally able to sit down, she found herself staring at her phone, Michael's words still echoing in her mind. You're not alone, Tanisha. Not anymore. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe it. Not that everything would be magically fixed. Not that her struggles would vanish overnight. But for the first time, she recognized that the wall she had built, out of fear, out of necessity, might finally have a crack in them. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to stay behind them anymore. Though, next morning, Tanisha awoke to a fresh set of challenges. Devin was still home from school, still under the weather, and there was a mountain of work waiting for her. But as she went about her day, she noticed something different. The weight on her shoulders didn't feel quite as heavy. Michael's words stayed with her, reminding her that she wasn't in this alone. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to have everything figured out. And maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone else in. Michael had never been one to show vulnerability. He had always been the one with the answers, the one with the plan. But as he sat in his office that morning, staring out at the city, he couldn't stop thinking about Tanisha. She had opened up to him in a way that no one had in years. She had shared her fears and her burdens, and instead of running from it, he had stepped closer. He had offered his help, his support, without hesitation, and yet something inside him stirred. He realized that maybe he wasn't just offering her a lifeline. Maybe in some ways, she was offering him one too. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt the pull to be more than just a CEO. He felt the pull to be a man who was emotionally present, who could give something more than just his professional success. He was ready to take a step forward, not just for Tanisha, but for himself. The quiet hum of the city echoed through the apartment windows as Michael sat on the edge of his couch, staring out into the night. He'd spent hours trying to focus on the work laid out before him, the endless emails, meetings, and reports. But his mind refused to settle. Instead, it kept drifting back to a conversation he had had just hours ago with the woman who had, in the most unexpected way, become a presence in his life. Tanisha. He could still hear her voice in his head, soft but steady, as they had spoken about everything and nothing. They had shared their frustrations, their doubts, and their most vulnerable thoughts. It was a level of honesty he hadn't allowed himself in years, a rawness that made him uncomfortable, yet strangely alive. He'd built his life around control, control over situations, control over his emotions. But here he was, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty. It wasn't the kind of uncertainty that came from fear, though. It was something else, a quiet, persistent feeling that there was more to life than what he had been pursuing. And it had started with one simple question. Your blind date didn't show up ours, you up either. For so long, he had been running, chasing success, chasing perfection. But now he wasn't sure what he was chasing anymore. Tanisha had shown him a different side of himself, a side he didn't even know he'd lost. He had learned to listen, to be present in the moment instead of always looking ahead. That night at the restaurant had marked the beginning of something he wasn't ready to name but was willing to explore. The sound of his phone buzzing on the coffee table interrupted his thoughts. It was a message from Tanisha. I've been thinking about our conversation. I'm not sure what this is, but I do know I'm not ready to let go of it yet. Let's take it slow, see where it goes. But I'd like to get to know you better. He smiled, a soft smile that reached his eyes. It was simple, yet it was everything he needed to hear, a slow beginning. No rush, no expectations. Just two people trying to figure out where they fit in each other's lives. And for the first time in years, Michael felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The next day, Tanisha sat at her kitchen table, staring at the message Michael had sent her. Her heart fluttered in her chest, but she wasn't sure why. There was a part of her that wanted to dive headfirst into whatever this connection was. But she was older now, wiser. Her son, Devin, came first. Always. She couldn't afford to lose sight of that, to let anything, no matter how compelling, distract her from the responsibilities she had built her life around. And yet, there was something in Michael's words that tugged at her, something about his sincerity, his willingness to meet her where she was. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected him to make space for her, to give her the room to navigate her fears, her doubts, her struggles. But he had, and that had made all the difference. She took a deep breath and typed her response. I think I can handle slow. It's been a long time since I've allowed myself to even consider something like this. But I'm willing to see where it takes us. Let's just be real, Michael. No pretenses. Let's see what happens. After hitting send, she sat back in her chair, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over her. There was no rush, no need to define everything in one moment. She was letting go of her walls piece by piece and trusting that what was meant to happen would unfold on its own. It felt right. For the first time in a long time, it felt right. A few days later, Tanisha and Michael met for coffee at a small cafe in the heart of the city. It was the kind of place that didn't rush you, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, allowing for conversations that didn't feel like they were ticking away under the pressure of an unseen clock. They sat across from each other, a comfortable silence between them as they sipped their drinks. Tanisha studied him for a moment, noticing the way his eyes seemed to soften when he wasn't thinking about something business-related. There was still a trace of the man who had been defined by success and achievement, but now she could see more. He was becoming someone else in her presence, a version of himself he hadn't shown to anyone, not even himself. You look different, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Not just from the other night, but in a way that feels lighter, less guarded. Michael looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. I think that's what happens when you start letting yourself be real with someone. Tanisha nodded. It's a strange feeling, isn't it? To stop pretending, even for a little while. I've spent so much of my life holding everything together, making sure I'm always in control, and now I'm just not. It's scary, but I'm starting to think it might be worth it. Michael leaned forward, his gaze intense. I get it. I've been the same way. But there's something about you, Tanisha, something that makes me want to try, even if I'm not entirely sure where it's going. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their words lingering between them. There was no pressure to make promises, no rush to define what they were. It was just two people sitting in the presence of something quietly powerful. The recognition of vulnerability, of connection, without the need for labels. Tanisha shifted in her seat, a small laugh escaping her lips. You're right. We don't need to figure it all out today. But I think we can give it a chance, see where it goes. Michael smiled, his expression softening. I'm in. No rush, just real. The following weeks were a series of small moments. Conversations over coffee, walks in the park, quiet dinners at home with Tanisha's son, Devin, who had begun to warm up to Michael in his own shy way. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of awkwardness, of uncertainty, but they both learned to lean into it instead of running away. Tanisha found herself laughing more, opening up in ways she hadn't in years. She felt herself becoming someone else, not someone defined solely by her responsibilities, but someone who could still experience the joy of connection, of being seen. She didn't have to be everything all at once. And Michael, he didn't expect her to be. He understood the weight she carried, and he wasn't there to fix her. He was simply there, in the quiet moments, offering support and understanding. They talked about their pasts, about the things they'd learned and the mistakes they'd made. They talked about their hopes for the future. Small dreams, but ones that felt more attainable now. And through it all, they never forced anything. They let their connection grow at its own pace, like a seed planted in the ground, waiting for the right conditions to bloom. And as the weeks turned into months, the connection between them deepened. They didn't need to define it. It wasn't about making promises or living up to expectations. It was about being real with each other, about showing up, and about choosing to trust that, for once, they didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. One evening as they sat on the couch in Tanisha's living room, Devin nestled between them with a book in his lap. Michael looked at Tanisha with a quiet smile. I'm glad we did this, he said, his voice soft. I didn't know what to expect, but I'm glad I let myself be vulnerable with you. Tanisha smiled back, her eyes warm. Me too. I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be. And for the first time in a long while, both of them felt a quiet peace settle over them, a sense that their paths had crossed for a reason, and that whatever came next, they were ready for it, together. In the stillness of the night, surrounded by the simple joy of being in each other's presence, Tanisha and Michael realized that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace, slowly, quietly, but with all the trust they had begun to build. And with that, their new beginning had already started.